how far can cruelty go inside a person who is perfectly sane? Because when we talk about horrific crimes, people often try to comfort themselves with one simple explanation. The killer must have been insane, but sometimes that explanation does not exist. Sometimes the person understands exactly what they are doing, and that is what makes this story so disturbing. This is the case of Janna Cassian, a young woman who came to Los Angeles chasing a dream, only to become the victim of one of the most brutal murders detectives in that city had ever seen. And the man responsible for her death was not a stranger. It was the man who claimed to love her. Los Angeles is a city built on dreams. People come here from all over the world. Actors, writers, filmmakers, entrepreneurs, all hoping to build a new life. Janna Cassian was one of those people. She was born and raised in Kyiv, Ukraine. Friends and family described her as curious, adventurous, and optimistic. She was highly educated, working as a tax lawyer before eventually deciding to move to the United States. Her dream was simple. She wanted a family. She wanted a child. And she believed that Los Angeles might be the place where her future would begin. For a while, it seemed that dream was coming true. Because in Los Angeles, she met a man named Blake Leibel. At first glance, Blake looked like the perfect partner. He was wealthy, extremely wealthy. His family in Toronto had made millions in real estate and manufacturing. His grandfather had founded a plastics empire, and his father was a major developer. Blake himself had inherited millions. But instead of continuing the family business, he wanted something different: Hollywood. He dreamed of writing, directing, and producing films. He worked on low-budget movies, graphic novels, and animated projects, hoping to eventually build a name for himself in the entertainment industry. People who met him often described him as friendly, somewhat eccentric, and deeply passionate about his creative ideas. But Blake's life was more complicated than it appeared. He grew up in a family filled with wealth, but also tension. His parents eventually separated. His older brother Cody went to live with their father in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Toronto. Blake stayed with his mother. Some people who knew the family later said Blake felt overshadowed by his brother. Cody was the confident one, the flashy one. He drove rare Ferraris, lived in multi-million-dollar homes, and moved easily through elite social circles. Blake, by contrast, was often described as more withdrawn. He spent long hours working on comics and creative projects. The relationship between the brothers was complicated, sometimes close, sometimes tense, and the relationship between Blake and his father was even more strained. But despite those family dynamics, Blake still lived a life that most people would consider extraordinary. He had money. He had connections. He had the freedom to pursue whatever dream he wanted. And for a long time, that dream was Hollywood. Years before Janna entered his life, Blake had already been married. His wife was Amanda Braun, a model. Together they had a son. By most accounts, their relationship looked stable from the outside. But in the summer of 2015, everything changed. Amanda was pregnant with their second child, and suddenly Blake left. He left the house, he left the marriage, and he began a relationship with another woman. That woman was Janna Cassian. According to people close to Janna, Blake told her that his marriage was already over. He said he was in the process of divorcing his wife. For Janna, who had come to America hoping to build a family, the relationship felt like the beginning of something real. Her mother, Olga, later said Janna believed Blake was the man she would marry, the man she would raise children with. And soon, another life-changing event followed. Janna became pregnant. In 2016, she gave birth to a baby girl named Diana. The child was born on Olga's birthday, a moment that the family saw as a sign of happiness and hope. Olga traveled from Ukraine to Los Angeles to help her daughter with the newborn. For those first days, the picture looked almost perfect. Blake, Janna, and their baby daughter together. Photos from that time show Blake smiling, holding the child, kissing Janna. According to Olga, he even used Russian words of affection with her daughter, calling her "my beloved." But that image of a happy family was fragile, because behind the scenes, Blake's life was far more chaotic than Janna realized. At the same time, he was living with Janna and their newborn daughter. Blake was also involved with another woman. Her name was Constance Bourgeois, and she lived in a house, also owned by Blake, only a few miles away. One life with Janna and the baby, another life with Constance, and a complicated, unfinished divorce with his wife Amanda. Investigators would later describe his situation as an unwieldy love quadrangle. 3 women, 1 man, and a situation that was becoming impossible to control. Then, only days after the birth of his daughter, the situation escalated. Constance accused Blake of sexual assault. Police arrested him. He was taken to jail, and it was Janna, the woman who had just given birth to his child, who helped bail him out. That moment exposed the truth about Blake's relationships. Janna learned that Blake had been seeing another woman. For someone who had just become a mother and believed she was building a life with him, the discovery must have been devastating. But according to her mother, Janna was afraid of losing him. Olga later said that Blake had begun to control her daughter's life. He demanded sex even while she was recovering from a C-section. He threatened to leave her for other women if she refused. And in order to keep the relationship alive, Janna made a painful decision. Her newborn daughter would stay with Olga in a separate apartment. Blake had paid for the apartment. The idea was that Janna could focus entirely on her relationship with him. Looking back, it is one of the most heartbreaking details in this entire story. A young mother separating from her newborn child because she believed it might save her relationship. But instead, it placed her even more deeply under Blake's control. And only days later, everything would spiral into violence. By late May of 2016, the tension between Janna and Blake was becoming impossible to ignore. Janna had just given birth. She was exhausted, physically vulnerable, and emotionally overwhelmed. Instead of stability, she was discovering that the man she trusted was living multiple lives. At the same time, Blake's world seemed to be tightening around him. His divorce was unresolved. His relationship with Constance had turned into a legal problem. And now, Janna knew the truth. For someone who was used to controlling situations with money and influence, that loss of control may have been difficult to handle. On May 23rd, 2016, Janna spent the day with her mother, Olga. Security footage later showed them shopping together. It was an ordinary day. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. But Olga later said something changed during that outing. Janna began receiving text messages. They were from Blake. And Olga noticed that every time Janna read one of those messages, her expression shifted. She later described it as watching her daughter transform like a chameleon. Something in those messages was clearly affecting her. Eventually, Janna told her mother she was going to see Blake. It would be the last time Olga saw her daughter alive. The following day, Olga tried calling Janna. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. By the 6th call, a feeling of dread had begun to grow. Parents sometimes describe a strange instinct. A sense that something is wrong even before they know what it is. Olga later said that was exactly what she felt. She called the police. But the response was limited. Officers attempted to check the situation, yet they had no immediate legal grounds to force entry into the apartment. At that point, it looked like a domestic matter. No screams, no reports of violence, no clear evidence of a crime. From a legal standpoint, the police had to be careful. Still, Olga remained deeply uneasy. The next day, she returned to the apartment building herself. What happened next only increased her fear. Standing outside the building, she looked up toward the 3rd-floor apartment where Janna and Blake lived, and she saw someone standing at the window. She believed it was Blake. Desperate, Olga tried to get inside the building. Another resident eventually opened the gate, allowing her into the complex. She ran upstairs and began pounding on the door. She rang the doorbell again and again. No answer. She called the police once more. Officers arrived and attempted to contact Blake by phone. They left a voicemail asking him to respond. But Blake did not come to the door. After waiting for several hours without clear signs of distress inside the apartment, the officers eventually left. Looking back, this moment remains one of the most painful questions in the entire case. Could more have been done? From the outside, it is always easier to ask that question after we know what happened. Police officers must balance many factors: legal limits, privacy rights, and the lack of visible evidence. Still, it is difficult not to wonder whether a different decision might have changed the outcome. Olga certainly believes it could have. By Thursday morning, her fear had turned into desperation. For 2 days, she had not heard from her daughter. She returned to the apartment again and called the police repeatedly, pleading for help. This time, officers agreed to conduct a welfare check inside the unit, because Janna had recently given birth. They were concerned she might be experiencing a medical emergency. When deputies arrived, they approached the apartment cautiously. They knocked. They announced themselves. Sheriff's Department. No response. Finally, they obtained a key from the building management. But when they unlocked the door and attempted to push it open, they discovered something strange. The door would not fully open. A hotel-style security latch had been engaged from the inside. That meant someone was still inside the apartment. The decision was made to breach the door. Officers forced their way into the condo. Immediately, they noticed something wrong. The living room appeared disturbed, furniture slightly out of place, a sense of disorder. As they moved deeper into the apartment, the obstacles continued. The hallway door leading to the bedrooms had been locked and barricaded. Deputies had to remove the door from its hinges. Inside the guest bedroom, they saw the first clear sign of violence. Blood. Blood on the walls. Blood on the headboard. They called out again. "Blake! Janna!" Still no answer. Moving further down the hallway, officers reached the master bedroom. The door was also barricaded. A mattress had been pushed against it from the inside. As deputies forced their way through the doorway, a voice suddenly called out from the room. It was Blake. He shouted that Janna was not there. Eventually, after a friend arrived and convinced him to cooperate, Blake opened the door. He emerged wearing only boxer shorts. Detectives would later say his behavior was strangely calm, but what they discovered inside the bedroom would haunt the investigators who entered that scene. Janna Cassian was lying on the bed. Her body was covered up to the chin with a Mickey Mouse blanket. At first glance, she appeared almost peaceful. But when detectives lifted her head from the pillow, they saw the full extent of her injuries. The brutality was almost impossible to describe. Her scalp had been removed. Her body was extremely pale. Not simply from death, but from something far more disturbing. Janna had died from exsanguination. In simple terms, she had been drained of blood. The pathologist later concluded that the process likely lasted between 6 and 8 hours. In other words, this had not been a quick act of violence. It had been prolonged. And investigators would soon discover that the crime scene itself had been carefully cleaned. Too carefully. At first glance, the apartment did not contain as much blood as detectives expected. But when forensic specialists used a chemical called Blue Star, a reagent similar to luminol, the truth appeared. Walls lit up. Floors lit up. Footprints appeared. Cleaning patterns became visible. The entire apartment glowed with hidden traces of blood. It became clear that someone had spent significant time trying to erase what had happened there. But they had not erased everything. Near the apartment's trash chute, investigators recovered multiple bags of evidence. Bedding, clothing, and towels soaked in blood. One item stood out, a bed skirt with a bloody handprint. The print was distinctive. Part of the pinky finger was missing. Blake Leibel was missing part of his right pinky finger. For investigators, that detail was impossible to ignore. At the same time, Blake himself showed signs of struggle. He had scratches on his face, bruises, and a bite mark on his arm. Evidence that Janna had fought for her life. Despite all of this, Blake denied any involvement in her death. He offered no explanation for what had happened. Instead, he made a single statement to detectives. "Science will tell you who did this." And in many ways, science did. The forensic evidence increasingly pointed toward Blake himself. But investigators still struggled with one haunting question. Why? What could possibly drive someone to commit an act this brutal against a woman he had claimed to love? The answer might lie not only in Blake's relationships, but also in something he had been creating for years. A graphic novel. One that depicted a killer who drained his victims of blood. And disturbingly, it was called Syndrome. The investigation into Janna Cassian's death was already disturbing. The brutality of the crime scene, the evidence that the violence had lasted for hours, the desperate signs that Janna had fought for her life. But as detectives continued digging into Blake Leibel's background, they discovered something that made the case even more chilling: a graphic novel. For years, Blake had been working on a project called Syndrome. It was a dark story about a violent killer. The imagery inside the book was disturbing, even by the standards of graphic fiction. One image in particular stood out: a victim hanging upside down, blood draining from the body. When prosecutors later saw those drawings, they believed they had found something important. Not just a creative project, a blueprint. During the trial, prosecutor Beth Silverman argued that Blake had not simply committed murder. He had acted out of fantasy. The prosecution presented images from the graphic novel alongside forensic evidence from the crime scene. In both cases, there were striking similarities: victims suspended or restrained, blood drained from the body, extreme violence that appeared almost ritualistic. According to the prosecution, this was not a sudden explosion of anger. This was a violent imagination that had finally crossed the line into reality. And during the hours in which Janna was dying, Blake continued to behave in ways that shocked investigators. Security footage showed food deliveries arriving at the apartment. While Janna was fighting for her life inside that bedroom, Blake had ordered food. For many people in the courtroom, that detail was almost impossible to process, because it suggested something deeply disturbing. Not panic, not fear, but a chilling sense of normality, as if the person responsible could step away from the violence long enough to eat, to continue moving through ordinary life, and then return to the crime. During the trial, Janna's mother Olga sat through every moment. She saw photographs that no parent should ever have to see, graphic images of what had been done to her daughter. Yet she insisted on being there. Later she explained why. Because someone who loved Janna needed to witness what she had endured. Someone needed to bear that pain with her. Blake's family was also present in the courtroom. His brother Cody attended the proceedings. But very few people who had known Blake earlier in his life were willing to speak publicly. Investigators tried to understand whether there had been warning signs. Was Blake violent as a child? Did anyone ever notice something disturbing in his behavior? But the answer from most people who knew him was the same. No. Nothing that clearly predicted what he would later do. That raised another unsettling possibility. Sometimes monstrous acts are not committed by people who have always seemed monstrous. Sometimes they are committed by individuals who appear normal, even privileged, until something inside them finally breaks. Or perhaps, until something inside them finally reveals itself. Psychologists involved in the case emphasized that Blake was not legally insane. He understood the difference between right and wrong. He understood the consequences of his actions, which meant that the law considered him fully responsible. After several days of testimony, the defense presented its final argument. Blake's attorney attempted to raise reasonable doubt. He suggested that the graphic novel did not prove Blake's intentions. Writers and artists had contributed to the story. Ideas were exchanged. The project was collaborative. Creative fiction, the defense argued, should not be mistaken for evidence of real-world violence. But the prosecution returned to the central question: the evidence. The blood, the attempts to clean the apartment, the handprint, the injuries, the hours during which Janna had suffered. And finally, the silence from Blake himself. After hearing both sides, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. It took them only 3 hours to reach a decision. Blake Leibel was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was announced, Blake showed little visible emotion. But outside the courtroom, Olga collapsed into grief. She cried out her daughter's name, apologizing for not being able to save her. Even now, years later, one question continues to follow this case. Could Janna have survived if help had arrived sooner? When Olga first called police, when she begged officers to check the apartment, when she stood outside the building and tried to get someone to open the door. From the outside, it is impossible to know exactly what would have changed. Police officers operate within strict legal limits. Without clear evidence of a crime, forcing entry into someone's home can be extremely difficult. Still, it is hard not to wonder whether more might have been possible. Whether a different decision, at a different moment, could have interrupted the nightmare unfolding inside that apartment. and that uncertainty has never fully disappeared. But there is another, even darker question that remains. How can a human being commit something like this while fully aware of what they are doing? Because in many crimes, people search for a simple explanation: madness, drugs, a moment of uncontrollable rage. In this case, none of those explanations fully apply. Blake Leibel was evaluated by mental health professionals. He was found competent. He knew what he was doing, which means the truth may be more disturbing. Sometimes cruelty is not the result of insanity. Sometimes it grows slowly, shaped by personality, childhood experiences, power, control, and fantasies that are allowed to exist for years without consequence. And when that darkness finally emerges, it can take a form that is almost impossible to understand. For me, the conclusion of this case feels unavoidable. Blake Leibel is guilty, not only in the eyes of the court, but in the moral sense as well. What happened to Janna Cassian was not an accident. It was not confusion. It was not a moment of panic. It was a deliberate act of extreme cruelty against a woman who trusted him and had just given birth to his child. And yet, the most unsettling realization may be this: the person who committed this crime was not a monster hiding outside society. He was a man who appeared educated, successful, creative. A man who could sit in a room, speak calmly, and explain his artistic ideas about fictional violence. While somewhere inside him, something far darker was waiting. And perhaps that is the most frightening part of this entire story. Not that cruelty exists, but that sometimes it can live inside a person who seems completely normal until the moment it no longer stays hidden.